So, here we are, the third instalment in our series on Joseph. And as we heard at the end of last week, a slandered and innocent Joseph, is now locked away in prison. So, without further ado, let's read on and find out what happens next. So, the chapter we're looking at today mainly is chapter 40 with the first verse of 41. But I'm actually going to read just from the very end of chapter 39, just to give us a little bit of context. So from verse 21 of chapter 39, it says this. So the Lord was with Joseph. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. After being in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, were held in prison, and they had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials, "Why do you look so sad today?" "We both had dreams," they answered, "but there's no one to interpret them." Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, "In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded and it blossomed and its clusters ripened into grapes, Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." "This is what it means," Joseph said to him. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. And you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand just as you used to when you were his cupbearer. But when it goes well with you, please remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, "I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." "This is what it means," Joseph said. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away at your flesh." Nice. Now, the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Then, when 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. So, we've heard a lot this morning, haven't we, about God being with us in the middle of our challenges and our disappointments. And I think there's a lot that Joseph's story can tell us about that. And this morning, as we go through what God is saying to us today, I think God is asking us just to sort of ask ourselves what he has to tell us about those times when we're in the middle of the hardship, when we're in the middle of the disappointment, and when we're in the middle of the confusion and in the middle of the waiting. Joseph has already faced a lot of those massive challenges himself, hasn't he? And the glimpses of hope, which he has had along the way, have all seemed to be sort of snatched away. And remember, Joseph can't turn to chapter 41. He has no idea what's going to happen next, does he? So he's in this place right now as we go through it today. So let's just very quickly review his journey to this point. So as Darren highlighted a few weeks ago, he was brought up in a completely dysfunctional family where he was hated and ostracized by his brothers for being his dad's favourite. He then has a dream which suggests that one day he is going to have authority over his brothers and they hate him even more. But he is still in a favoured position. He's the favourite and protected son of a pretty wealthy man, actually. So he could have justifiably expected to have looked towards quite a bright future. But then what happens instead? His father sends him to try and find his brothers. They attack him, they throw him in a pit, and he's sold into slavery. Imagine the trauma for anyone, let alone a 17-year-old boy. And then we heard last week, as Paul preached, he's bought by Potiphar. And for a while, things seem to be on an upward trajectory. We're told that the Lord is with him and bless him in all he does. So much that Potiphar recognizes something about him, something of God with him. And Potiphar makes Joseph his attendant. He promotes him, it says, and basically entrusts the running of the whole household to him. Things seem to be on a bit of an even keel again, don't they? And then Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him. And when he refuses to dishonor God and give in to her, what happens? He's accused of attempted rape and he's thrown into prison. So here he is. Psalm 105 actually gives a slight insight into the conditions Joseph faced while he was in prison. Verse 18 of Psalm 105 says, "They bruised his feet with shackles, his neck was put in iron." So when we think of Joseph, we often sort of associate him with dreams, don't we? But this actually is the stuff of nightmares, really. In human terms, he was completely powerless. He was already considered the lowest of the low, a slave, something to be treated as a possession and bought and sold, rather than as a human being. He was also now a convict, so basically labelled a sexual predator. And again, in human terms, he is completely alone. There is no other human being to speak for him or defend him. There is no one who is going to listen to him or to believe him. At this point, there is absolutely no earthly reason why he wouldn't expect to just rot in jail until he dies. So despite his obedience, his faithfulness, his continued integrity and honouring of God, he's hit another brick wall. And at this point, he actually appears further from the promises of God than he ever was. Yet even here, God was with him. It says that the warden put Joseph in charge over the other prisoners and everything done there. He paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with him and gave him success in everything he did. You're beginning to notice a bit of a pattern here in Joseph's story. Yet again, in the middle of an unimaginably horrible situation, Joseph knew God's presence and blessing. Yet again, he was trusted with responsibility, and his spiritual gifting as an administrator was recognized and utilized, and he partnered with God in that. And then comes this account of Joseph, interpreting the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker. Now, I love this story. I love the glimpse it gives us of Joseph's heart and his faith in God. And I love too how it shows us that there is a God at work to bring about his plans and purposes, which actually go far beyond anything that Joseph could have possibly imagined at this particular point in his journey. So first, as we've read, Pharaoh became angry with his chief cupbearer and his chief baker, and he put them in prison. So we don't know what they did to incur Pharaoh's wrath. I did read a fair number of commentaries who speculated on that, but there's nothing written here that confirms what they did. However, we do know that it was God's work. God was at work to put them into Joseph's path in prison. We know that because of what happened next. And what happens next is that they're given dreams. Now, bear in mind, these two men are Egyptians. So they don't worship God in any way, in any shape, in any form. And yet, they have God-given dreams. And what's more, they are able to recognize that those dreams aren't just the product of an overactive imagination, that there is something more to them. So this is God at work. This is a God who will use anything and anyone, actually, to bring about his providential plans and purposes. And then next, as we read, Joseph notices that his charges are troubled. Now again, he's not just going through the motions here, is he? This isn't a man so caught up in his own problems or the injustice of his situation that he doesn't have the time or the inclination to do anything more than is absolutely necessary to get by. That's not what we're looking at here. We're looking at a man who notices they are troubled, and having noticed, he takes time to stop, and he takes time to ask them what is wrong. So Joseph goes the extra mile. He has compassion. He cares in that situation. And when he's told the men have had a dream and have no one to interpret them, Joseph's immediate response is to point them towards God. He says, doesn't he, do not interpretations belong to God? Now he's speaking to men who would have been used to consulting Egyptian diviners, I think they were called, for answers. So they would have spent their life looking in completely the wrong direction, actually, for their help and for their inspiration. And Joseph immediately makes it clear that in the past they've been putting their confidence in the wrong place. He shows them and points them towards the only answer, God. And he is fully confident that once he hears the dreams, God is going to give him the interpretation, isn't he? Now, I don't know about you, but I find this continued faith and confidence in God quite awe-inspiring, actually, given everything Joseph has been through up until this point. At the age of 17, remember, he was given his own dreams, which seemed to point towards God's plans for his life. And here he is, at the age of 28, stuck in prison, with nothing at this stage to suggest he's ever going to get out. And at this particular point, those dreams kind of seem a bit dead in the water, don't they, in human terms? Yet he remains faithful to God. He trusts God, and he trusts that God can and will use him. And despite the fact that his own dreams seem beyond reach, he's still willing to make himself available to help these two men with their dreams, with the dreams that they've just had. And what's more, he isn't just faithful in making himself available for God, he's actually equally faithful in the application of what God tells him to do, in the giving of the interpretations, and he's courageous as well, actually. So it must have been great hearing the first dream and having such an encouraging interpretation from God for the cupbearer. I mean, who doesn't love being the bearer of good news? Who doesn't love being able to give an encouraging word to someone from God? And what's even better, Joseph begins to see that this could be God's provision for him. His means of getting out of prison. Suddenly, a slight light seems to appear from nowhere. The cupbearer, remember, as a cupbearer, has powerful influence and the ear of Pharaoh. We've heard that in previous weeks. One word from him and Joseph's circumstances could change beyond recognition. So it must have been a moment of real hope and encouragement for Joseph. But then imagine how Joseph felt as he heard the second dream and realized what God was saying to the chief baker. How hard must it have been to tell that chief baker that in 3 days he was going to be executed? I mean, even in this, we see how Joseph honours and trusts God. He could have bottled it. He could have said, it isn't totally clear. I need a bit more time to pray about this one. And then just made himself scarce for 3 days. He could have done that. He could have justifiably told himself that was the right thing to do, that he was being kind by not burdening the baker with the knowledge that he was about to die. We've already seen that Joseph was a compassionate man. He had compassion for both these men when he saw how troubled they were. And after all, it was the first dream that was important. That's the one that God could potentially use to get Joseph out of prison. There isn't really any benefit in telling this poor man that in 3 days' time he's going to be impaled on a pole and birds are going to pick at his flesh. Why give him 3 days filled with terror? But that isn't how Joseph thinks, and it isn't how he acts. He has no way of knowing how this episode is going to fit into the bigger picture of his life. All he knew was that whatever reason God had, God is a sovereign God, and he wanted these dreams interpreted fully. And he chose him to do it. So he faithfully and he diligently obeys, even when that obedience means undertaking a task which probably didn't make a whole lot of sense and must have been monumentally difficult to do. I can imagine what the next 3 days must have been like for all of them, actually, in different ways. For the baker, for obvious reasons. Who wants to hear they're going to be executed in 3 days' time? For the cupbearer, on tenterhooks, wondering if he really is going to be restored to his position. And even for Joseph, who, having made his appeal to the cupbearer, clearly believed this could be the opportunity God was going to use to bring about his freedom and his vindication. All his years of suffering could be over soon. And then it happens. 3 days later, the cupbearer and the baker are indeed summoned by Pharaoh. The cupbearer is restored and the baker is executed. It all came to pass as Joseph had foretold. But what doesn't happen is Joseph's freedom and vindication. Instead, we have this one devastating line at the end of chapter 40. The chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. I can't even imagine what that must have been like for Joseph. I mean, we obviously don't know how many days or maybe even weeks he waited in hope before finally realizing that the cupbearer hadn't spoken to Pharaoh and that help wasn't coming anytime soon. He'd been faithful to God. He'd obediently served and honoured God. He'd stayed open and faithful and was used by God to interpret a man's dream, promising his restoration, and then he'd watched as that dream is fulfilled in the space of 3 days, whilst here he is in prison, and the dreams God had given him 11 years ago seem no closer to becoming a reality than before. So let's just return quickly to the question we asked ourselves in the beginning. How do we see God moving in the middle of our hardships, in the middle of our disappointments, in the middle of our confusion, in the middle of our waiting? We can see, can't we, that Joseph's story does have a lot to teach us about that. There are 3 things, actually, from what we've read this morning that I think God would like to bring out. There's undoubtedly more, but these are the 3 that I just feel God has highlighted to me as I've studied this. The first is this, that God is always good and he is always faithful. So throughout the whole story of Joseph to this point, we've seen God at work, haven't we? Remember those phrases that have popped up at various points. The Lord was with Joseph and he prospered. His master saw that Joseph was with him and gave him success. The Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favour. The prison warden, and now and here in chapter 40, God bringing about the meeting with the cupbearer and the baker and giving Joseph the prophetic interpretation. During Paul's preach last week, he mentioned quite a few relevant Bible verses, and one of them stuck out to me because actually it's a verse I think of whenever I read the story of Joseph, and it's Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose. Now these verses are very easy to stand on and quote when life's going well, isn't it? Let's face it. They're very easy to champion. So for example, if your all things happens to be that you've just got your dream job that you've been praying for, or you've been telling a friend about Jesus and they become a Christian, or maybe you've, just got engaged to the most amazing man or woman on the face of the earth. It's quite easy to praise God and thank him. Yes, all things work together for the good, because we can see the good right there in front of us. But what about if you've been for 10 job interviews and been rejected for them all? Or if you've faithfully stood up for your faith and been rejected or ridiculed for it? Or if you've prayed for that partner and you're still single, or you've known the disappointment of a relationship not working out? We could replace those examples with many others, couldn't we? The bottom line is life doesn't always go the way we hope, and we do find ourselves in situations which are sometimes very hard to understand. Sometimes they are quite devastating. But God promises that in all things he will work for the good of those who love him. Now, our situations, like Joseph's were, probably in most cases are going to be brought about by the sin and the unrighteousness of others, or even, potentially, by an attack of the enemy seeking to stop us in our tracks. But that doesn't change the fact that in all things, even in those things, God works for the good of those that love him and for his glory. And in this story of Joseph, we can see that hope. Because as we've heard, God remained with Joseph throughout. He showed him kindness and he worked on his behalf time and again. Why didn't God just move to make it all okay? Why hadn't he just revealed the injustice and vindicated Joseph? He could have done that. He could have done it in an instant if he'd wanted to. Well, nowhere are we promised that being a Christian will lead to a trouble-free life. In fact, we're rather promised the reverse in a lot of places. In Romans 5:3-4, we're told to glory in our sufferings because we know that those sufferings produce perseverance, character, and character, hope. In James 1:2, we're told to consider it pure joy when you face trials of many kinds because the testing of your faith produces perseverance. And again in verse 12, James says, blessed is the one who perseveres under trials because having stood the test, he will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. There's plenty of other verses that I could quote. But in all of these verses, there's an expectation that trials and persecution are going to come. Not that they might, but that they will. However, there's also a promise attached to them. God promises to work through the persecutions and the trials we face to form and grow our character, to bring us greater perseverance and hope, and to ultimately give us that crown of life and an inheritance from the Lord. He is working to fulfill his purposes in our lives. And that's what God was doing with Joseph. He was refining him. He was teaching him. He was preparing him for all that was to come. As Paul said in his preach last week, Joseph was being added to. Which brings us to point 2. Be defined by God, not by circumstances. Now, we don't know what Joseph specifically thought or felt during this journey because the text doesn't tell us. I've no doubt there were several times he was pretty fed up. We do know he was well aware of the injustice of his situation because of the way he describes it in the passage we've read today. In verse 15, he says he was forcibly carried off and that he's done nothing to deserve being in a dungeon. And in a few weeks, a bit of a spoiler alert, when we hear about him finally meeting his brothers again and God's promises coming to pass, we will also hear something of the pain he's carried with him over the years because of everything that's happened to him. But as of now, there's no indication in the text of his thoughts or feelings or the conversations he may have had with God, probably did have with God on several occasions, about all that was happening to him. What we do know is what didn't happen. We do know that whatever hurt and pain Joseph had, he didn't allow it to fester. It didn't become bitterness or anger. There was no festering of injustice at everything that had happened. At no stage did he just give up and sink into a pit of despair or turn his back on God. Now we know that because of what the text does tell us. It tells us how people responded to Joseph and also how he responded in the situations he found himself in. Just cast your mind back to when his father sent him to find his brothers. Now his fathers knew that Joseph was Joseph was treated by his brothers, and yet he still trusted Joseph to be diligent and give him a fair and accurate report. And Joseph, who obviously didn't know what was coming, but could have been under no illusions at the lack of welcome he'd get, doesn't try to get out of it. He immediately obeys. And he doesn't just go through the motions, he gives 100%. He even travels further to find them when they aren't where he expects them to be. And then in Potiphar's house, Potiphar trusted Joseph with everything he owned. Remember it said he never had to worry about a thing? That's a confidence you only place in someone who's shown themselves to be completely faithful and trustworthy. Joseph clearly works for Potiphar diligently, faithfully, and with excellence, honouring that trust in every way. Even refusing Potiphar's wife, who had incredible influence and could have used that power to cause a mere slave an immense amount of trouble, which she obviously did later on, didn't she? And then, as we've heard this morning, Joseph continued to be faithful. He continued to be trustworthy. He continued to work with excellence and applied himself 100% to every role he was given in the prison. The warden didn't have to worry about anything Joseph was in charge of. He went the extra mile with those in his care, noticing when they were troubled. He pointed them towards God. God uses him to interpret the two dreams, and he does so obediently, even when it was difficult to do so. True, God gave him that success. God opened those doors. But Joseph had to make the decision to be faithful to God. He had to make the decision to partner with God. And he didn't let his circumstances define him, did he? He didn't become bitter or angry or just tread water or twiddle his thumbs where he was until God brought those promises to pass so that he could then be who God had called him to be. He was faithful in the middle of the challenge. He was faithful in the middle of the injustice. He was faithful in the middle of the waiting. Whether he was being ostracized and hated by his brothers, whether he was a slave in Potiphar's house, whether he was imprisoned unjustly, Joseph served God where he was with the gifts God had given him. In Ephesians 2, verse 10, I think this was quoted by Darren or Paul over the last few weeks, it's told that we are God's workmanship, we're God's masterpiece, created for work God has prepared in advance for us to do. So we may well be in a place of challenge and waiting. We might well be there now, some of us. We may not know when God's promises to us are going to come to full fruition, but in that place, just as God was with Joseph, he's with us. And if we're open to him, he will give us opportunities to be all he has called us to be faithful, to be diligent, to be kind, to be compassionate, to use 100% of our gifts for others' good and for God's glory. This is on-the-job training that we're in, people. And as we obey, we grow. We are added to. And last but not least, point 3. We are part of something bigger than we can ever be alone. Now, I'm going to show my age. Who remembers Tony Hart? Yeah, some are putting your hands up. For those who are wondering what on earth I'm talking about, let me explain. He was an artist, and he had a children's programme back in the day. Now, years ago, God spoke to me one day while I was having my quiet time, and it was at a time when I was a bit confused about something that was happening in my life. And he reminded me quite randomly about this programme. Now, one of the things Tony Hart did during this programme was he'd stand in front of a big wall, or occasionally in front of a big bit of paper on the ground. Do you remember this? And what he did was he'd start to paint. And generally he'd start to paint in the middle of the page. And as he did, there'd be sort of colours, and there'd be sort of various shapes that would appear on this page. It was all very intriguing. But although sometimes you might have had a vague idea of something that he was painting, generally speaking, you didn't really have a clue what was going on. Until, at the very end, the camera would pan back. And at that point, you'd see this amazing piece of finished artwork. And God, at the time, spoke to me really clearly through that picture. And he reminded me that he chose me, and that he loves me, and that he has called me to be a part of his story. And I may not fully understand what is going on. It might actually seem like a higgledy-piggledy mess sometimes, but I can trust the artist. I can trust him. He sees the full picture, and he is creating a work of art which is ultimately for his glory. And I'm a part of that. At the right time, he will pan the camera back, and he will reveal his full plans and his full purposes. But he can't do that until all the parts of that painting are fully in place. So when we leave Joseph at the end of chapter 40, his situation appears utterly desperate, doesn't it? Again, he's had his hopes dashed. Again, he's alone with no one to speak for him. And I'm sure that at that moment in time, nothing would have seemed to have made an awful lot of sense. And it seems like a bit of a weird place to end, but actually that's the reality of life sometimes. Sometimes we're all sitting in that place. We're still waiting to find out how this is all going to end, how this is all going to finish. And for all of us, there will be times when we feel like that. None of us are immune. You might be there now. If you are, there's encouragement for you today. You are a valued and a precious part of God's bigger story. And that story hasn't finished yet. Because whilst it would be another 2 years before the camera pans back for Joseph, and he gets to see the bigger picture that God is creating, we have seen the start of chapter 41, haven't we? And we know that after the abandonment, there is another dream. And in the next instalment, with Darren in a couple of weeks' time, we will see that God was most definitely still with Joseph, and that he was still at work to bring about his plans and purposes beyond anything Joseph could ever have imagined. To be continued.